hello again, and welcome to another episode of Sermon B-Sides. My name is Rusten. I'm one of the pastors at Cormdale Church, and I'm here with Pastor Jon. What's up, Pastor Jon?
Hey, it's good. This is nice.
Yeah, we're just talking about how much we enjoy being in our office, in our nice office chairs, and our nice microphones for B-Sides. So
and logistically, it's really nice because you spend Monday at home.
Yes.
You work from home on Monday.
Yep.
And Monday is my study all day. So this is kind of like a nice little mental break after studying for Exodus 3. And
you have all this stuff in your brain too, which is probably fun.
Yeah. It gives me something to look forward to after the study. It's like I'm not just walking away. I gotta do this. So
I do have to say that something about being on video makes me want to bring back the whiskey at times.
Well, there might be a bottle hidden behind me somewhere.
You might be able to see one up there. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're talking today about Exodus chapter 2. One of the things I love about Exodus is that, at least for the first 18 chapters, it's a lot of, or 20 chapters, it's a lot of straight action. It's it moves fast.
Yeah, because it does slow down at the end.
It slows down. It's like, we're just gonna
the 20th time around the tabernacle.
Exactly. Yeah. So Exodus 2.
Yeah.
So Exodus 1 frames the crisis, right?
Yep.
And it frames it in light of God's blessing them. There's a reason why they're being fruitful and multiplying, and they're just having babies like gangbusters. It's just the reason why that's happening is because God promised that he would make them a mighty nation, right? Yeah. But you don't necessarily get it from the promise until I think Abraham's his third vision of the covenant, where God tells him, just so you know, your ancestors, your progeny, not your ancestors, your future progeny, they're going to be in slavery for 400 years, right? Yeah. He tells them that, and so this shouldn't be a surprise to us as we read Genesis to Exodus if this is your first time. But there's,
I wonder if they're debating, is it 400 literal years?
I think it's symbolic, So
is this pre 400 or off 400 or post 400? Sorry, just had to.
I know. I was trying to figure out what the way you'd say 400 is, but I don't think there is a cool way to say it. Millennium just sounds super cool, but there's not one of those for 400. Okay, so they are being fruitful and multiplying. They've become a threat to Pharaoh. The Pharaoh has rejected the Christian God, and he is now threatened by these Christian families who are filling his kingdom, and he rightly knows that they're going to have a huge impact on his kingdom if he doesn't do something about it. And so he first tries to squelch them, crush them through putting them into slavery, and then give them heavy burdens, and then he's going to go after their babies, and then we see a little bit of how resistance is by the Hebrew midwives through righteous deception.
Thank you, James Jordan.
Yeah, read James Jordan. He's just a lot of fun to read. And, sometimes you need a little shot of whiskey to I need to forget that point or something like that. But
I think it's a shot of whiskey in a couple years.
Yeah.
Because I when we went through Genesis, it's the first time I was introduced to righteous deception in Genesis 12 with Abraham. And James Jordan's this is what's going on. And I was like, I don't know about that. And then, so that was 2019 or something like that. And then when we got into Exodus 2, I was like, I think he actually saw something there. There's a pattern that repeats itself.
Yeah, every time I feel that James Jordan says something that I'm I don't know if I agree with that. It's it just kind of takes time to settle, and then all of a sudden I'm how did I not see that before? Because it's clearly there. So anyways, I enjoy James Jordan. You enjoy James Jordan. He's helped us in a lot of ways.
And the weird stuff that he does say isn't weird like Andy Stanley weird stuff. So
no,
this is qualified. He does say weird things, but not like that.
Yeah, he says stuff like, there are no donut trees in the garden. That's why that's what's missing in the garden. There's no donut trees. And the reason he says that is because he's saying there's a goal for creation, and that goal includes donuts, and the garden doesn't have those donuts, and so man has to figure out through finding what God has hidden how to make donuts, and that's one of the many things, and those are the kind of good things you'll get from Jordan. So, okay, so moving on back to Exodus 2 after the long James Jordan plug. There is a point now where, okay, crisis, midwives have done something. But what's God going to do next, right? What's God going to do next? And I think that the end of chapter 1 says that God, the people of God are crying out, correct? They're crying out.
At the end of chapter 1.
Is that the end of chapter 1 or chapter 2?
That's the end of chapter 2. It says, every son, it's just a repetition of the king's edict. Every born to the Hebrews, you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Which is interesting because he basically deputizes the entire Egyptian population to kill Christian babies. So
this is something that's a play that tyrants have used many times. Basically weaponize the entire populace against whoever they're going after, and usually Christians.
Yeah, like if you see these Christians gathering in groups too big and they're too close to each other, here's a website you can report them. Wait.
Oh man, too close, too close to home.
Too soon.
I'm all about it. Let's expose those guys. So, okay, so they now the question is what's God going to do? And the opening of chapter 2 is with the introduction of a character we know very well from biblical history, Moses. And it tells his birth story, and it tells, born in the midst of this conflict, not a good time to be born, right? And when they're going after baby boys, and then how he's rescued from that attack upon babies, and then how he gets raised up, and then how he's basically raised up. There's this conflict he experiences, and then he goes away and he gets married in Midian. That's basically this chapter in a nutshell, except for the very end, which says God heard the cries of the people, and he remembered, which I think is we're gonna have to get into. What does that mean that God remembered? But I think that the thing I want to dig into is something you emphasized during the sermon, which is that there's a lot of new creation hints here.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a lot of can you kind of just go through some of those hints?
Yeah, so one of the things that that I was trying to do, particularly in this sermon, because it will set things up in the future, is like to get the rhythm, get the pattern. So you're not reading Exodus in a vacuum. I don't think we talked about this in the previous episode, but the first word in Hebrew of Exodus is and it means that this story is continuing, and so there are patterns that are repeated. One of the patterns is that there's a cycle of facing and dealing with threats to God's promises. So when that happens, God overcomes those threats, and we've seen that in Genesis. And now it's extending into Exodus. So the threat that has come up is the king of Egypt, who's killing these families, and of course the promise is families and an offspring that's coming in the future. So you're seeing patterns repeated, patterns that are established in Genesis are repeating in Exodus and are actually echoing through all the scriptures. And some of that's really obvious, and other ones are a little bit less obvious and take a little more work to show up. And I've totally forgotten the question that you asked me.
Oh, just like the new creation hints.
The new creation. Yeah. Okay, so excuse me. There's this weird detail about Moses's mom looking at the boy and saying, "Oh, he's a fine boy," and then and she's like going to save him, and it really leaves you wondering, like, if he was ugly, what would have happened? It's like this. I mean, that's how I read it. If you don't know what word
he was a fine boy, so she saved him. Yeah,
he's a fine lad. So, but the word that she uses, the same word used in Genesis 1 of the creation, that God looks at what He's creating, and it's good.
It's good.
So the Hebrew reader of this would notice that word and go, oh, just like God looked at his creation and said it was good, Moses' mom looked at his creation and said it was good. What's interesting is that there's a juxtaposition or a contrast there, because Pharaoh looks at these babies and says they're bad.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
But Moses' mom looks and says, oh, it's good.
Yep.
The other big detail there is in verse 3, where it says that Moses was placed in a basket. And I talked about like that word is actually ark, and it's used 28 times, 2 times in the book of Exodus. The other 26 times are in Genesis, and it always means ark.
Yep.
Always means ark. So whenever a person is placed in an ark, right, what that means is there's judgment and there's deliverance and there's an after the ark. The ark is the way that God is preserving humanity to start over. So there's a new creation. And in Genesis, it's very obvious, because when Noah comes out of that ark, you have he makes an altar and he makes an offering to God, but you also have God repeating the cultural mandate that he gave to Adam. And the flood is a decreative act. Genesis 1 and 2, God creates everything. There's sin. God judges it through decreation. Now we have new creation with Noah and his family and that mission moving forward. So when the text says that Moses is put in an ark, we should know there's judgment waters, which there were with the Nile. That was where these babies were thrown. But there's also a judgment coming in Egypt, right? That's coming later in chapter 12. And when he's placed in an ark, it means that there's going to be a deliverance through a judgment, and God is going to be starting again, just like he did with Noah and his family.
It also means there's going to be decreation.
There's going to be decreation, right?
Which
Absolutely.
we're gonna see that in the coming chapters.
And a little tease here. What's really interesting, and I'm sure we'll mention this, but you have 10 acts of decreation.
Yep.
Countered by 10 words of recreation in the law.
Yes. That's so good.
That's not coincidental. God is going to destroy and judge by 10 acts, and he's going to establish a people, a covenantal people now.
Yeah.
Not just a family, but a nation.
Yes.
And that's also going to be 10 acts or 10 words.
Yeah. There are some kind of like significant, you know how like there's a lot of like recapitulating themes, right? Mm-hmm. But then each theme's going to have its significant differences that kind of like either develop something or hash it out in a way that like lets you see another angle of it, right? Yeah. And in this instance, one of the things that's interesting is that Moses is experiencing Noah's flood, as it were, but by himself, solo. Before later, he will bring God's people through a waters of judgment, redemption.
Yes.
And so there's this interesting theme of like, and I think that's, I mean, you might see some of that play up in Joseph too, because Joseph goes into slavery, right? And he comes out a king, right? There's something happening there too that's maybe even preempting the whole Exodus thing, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And so you have this theme of like something happens to God's man before it happens to God's people.
Yes.
And that, I mean, we could look at that in all kinds of ways, but we definitely see that like throughout the story of Scripture, but we definitely see that in the story of Christ.
Yes. And it happens to God's man first, and then it happens to God's people through their union or baptism into God's man.
Yes.
Because Israel is baptized into Moses. So it happens to Moses, and then it happens to God's people as he is their deliverer. But then it also happens with Christ. Christ goes into the judgment waters of the cross, right? Yep. But he lives. He goes through it. And then what do we do? In baptism, we are entering into the waters, like, and in Romans 6 says that we're baptized into his death. How could that be good? Well, it's good because he conquered death.
Yes.
His death is a death conquering death. So we're baptized into him so that we too can go into those waters and be spared. But everybody who's not baptized into the name of Christ goes into death, and death beats them.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's that. Yeah.
That whole idea, like maybe it's something that comes up in Joseph, maybe even elsewhere I'm not aware of, but it's so crystal clear here with Moses how it happens to him first before it happens to the people. And yeah, you brought up 1 Corinthians 10 again, which always I always scratch my head like, why is he getting baptized into Moses? But that's what this is talking about. It's like which is, I think you also mentioned that he's Levitical. Like he's pre-Levitical, like he is before Levites were a priesthood, he acts as the first priest, right? And so you have there's a sense in which he's a representative in that way. Mm-hmm. Like you need a priest to represent you, and he represents the people. And so Moses is kind of functioning as a priesthood, and that a priest in that regard, and that people get baptized into Moses. That term is just like makes us scratch our head. But if you start looking at Exodus, what's going on here, it makes more sense. Yeah. So
one of the things that we're kind of I want to explicitly say it is that Exodus is the paradigm for understanding the gospel.
It is. Yep.
It more than any other book in the Old Testament, this book creates the categories and the patterns for the gospel, so much so that when Matthew is introducing us to the birth of Christ, he is drawing heavily from Exodus, like just story after story, especially with the birth of Christ, that Exodus is the story that happens again in Christ. Slavery, tyranny, the birth stories, all of it, even like with baptism in Moses, baptism in the Christ, all of that is. So I just want to say it. It's massively important. If you don't understand Exodus, you're not going to understand the gospel.
Yep. It's crucial, and I think that this idea of the representative going first is also brought up a lot by Jesus himself in the Gospel of John. One of if you go and read the Gospel of John through fast, you'll see that Jesus finds himself getting into the same discourse with the Pharisees at I think it's 3 or 4 different times, and every time he gets into it, he builds upon it. And one of the things that he says is, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow. Where I'm going, you cannot follow." And then at the very end, he says, "Where I'm going, you cannot follow, but I'm going there to prepare a place for you, and then I will bring you in."
Yeah.
Right. And there's a sense in which that's what happened to Moses. He went where the Hebrews could not follow, where the early Christians in Egypt could not follow. And he went, and it's kind of like unbeknownst to him. He didn't really I don't know how much he really knew what was going on. It sure seems like he was not really resolved to go back when God calls him to go back. But it happens to him first, and then the people follow him. So that's
so you're talking about Exodus 2 when he goes into Midian and he meets his wife.
Yeah.
And absolutely.
And I mean, even like where Sinai has 2 names, which I didn't realize this until it's like silly things
this
you don't
where
realize.
He's at in Exodus 2.
He's in Midian in Exodus 2, and when he goes on to what's the mount that the
Mount
burning
Horeb.
bushes? Mount Horeb. Horeb is the same mount as Sinai.
It's Sinai.
But
Sinai, you're getting into the next episode. We can't go there.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. So, but just that theme of I go there first, and then you're coming after me is just all over the place. So,
absolutely.
So, your 3 points were God's man, God's method, and God's memory. One of the things that I would love to dig into now is the method portion, which that's where you kind of unpack so we have this scene where Moses acts as like a deliverer. I can in my mind I can remember the cartoons I watched of Joseph in this scene, and it's always like Joseph made a terrible error, right? Moses made a terrible error because he wasn't a pacifist, and he saves this Hebrew guys from their taskmaster, but he ends up just botching the whole thing or something.
Yeah.
But that's not the way the text presents it.
No.
So can you talk a little bit about what do we see in the text there?
Well, okay, so you go from the birth to this. It immediately just switches to the scene where two of Moses's Hebrew brothers are being oppressed by this Egyptian, and the language kind of softens what the Hebrews are experiencing. It's very likely that this Egyptian slave master is on the verge of killing these Hebrew men, right? So this is a charged, violent situation. So Moses intercedes, and it appears that the Egyptian dies as a result of it, right?
Yeah.
And then Moses is afraid because Pharaoh's going to find out, and then Pharaoh's going to kill Moses because Moses killed this Egyptian, right? And so you kind of, if you just read that verse by itself or read this chapter by itself, there's something in us that wants to say, oh, this was wrong. He messed this up. And I do think that there's something wrong, but it's not the thing that we necessarily think might be wrong, because in Acts chapter 7, when Stephen is, interestingly enough, preaching the gospel from the Old Testament, and he gets killed for it, which is interesting, because he's talking about the deliverer, and he ends up dying.
It was funny, as his whole sermon is about how they kill the Jews, the Pharisees, the history of God's people killing prophets, and then he gets killed.
He gets killed.
It's like, and as my final act of sermonizing is, you're going to kill me.
My final piece of evidence is,
yes.
So he celebrates Moses, and the way he talks about it, it's that Moses has some sort of awareness that God was calling him to be a deliverer of the people.
Yeah.
And so Stephen is actually celebrating Moses for this. Now, to back up a little bit, in the first 3 chapters, there are 3 things that there's a consistent, like we talked about, righteous deception.
Yep.
Just at the very end, I think, of the last episode, there's 3 things that happen that are very unsettling to our sensibilities. So the midwives are lying to the authorities about these Hebrew baby boys that they're actually saving instead of killing, right? They're lying to the authorities. They're Romans 13. They're lying to them. Excuse me. And they're blessed for it. God gives them families, right?
Yeah.
Here, Moses takes the life of this Egyptian guy and spares his Hebrew brothers. And we're kind of like, what do we do? In the next chapter, if we'll get ahead a little bit, when God's talking to Moses about addressing Pharaoh to bring his people out, he says, tell Pharaoh that we're going to travel 3 days to have a feast in the wilderness.
Yeah, it's going to do a little more than a feast.
But they're not going for 3 days, you know?
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So it kind of leans into that.
The feast is never ending. That's the
Yeah, and it's a little more than 3 days, you know?
Yeah. Oh,
that wasn't the intention. It was.
Yeah.
So anyways.
3 days is interesting.
3 days is interesting.
Yeah.
As is the 3 months that Moses is nursed and hidden. And then he appears.
Yeah.
I didn't go into that in the sermon, but that's interesting as well.
Yeah. So there is, so the question of like, was Moses right in doing this? One of the things I always found interesting, like you talked about Stephen's sermon, which seems like it commends him, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But if people are listening, go read it, and it's I think it's 7:23 through 26 somewhere in there that he commends Moses. Yeah.
The other passage that I find really interesting is Hebrews 11, talking about Moses, and it's weirdly, if you read it, it's hard to know if he's talking about this incident, but it sure seems like he's hinting at it, because it says, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. So you might be looking at this and going, I didn't remember reading about that in Exodus. But then it says, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. Is he, it seems like everything in that point in Hebrews, what he's referring to is like, so when did he choose to rather be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin? Well, was it when he decided to side with them and go after their attackers? And what's interesting is it says he considered the reproach of Christ. Again, Christians in Exodus, he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. When as soon as Moses steps out of his place as a son of Egypt and attacks the Egyptian, he's now said, "I am with these people. I will bear the reproach of these slaves." Right? And so I always read that and thought, is that what he's talking about? Sure, it sure seems like it, because the next thing he says is about fleeing Egypt, which is, we know that this is the incident that led to his fleeing of Egypt. So, but I find that interesting, because it means that his this act would be considered bearing the reproach of Christ. I don't know
for sure.
So
it messes. I think it messes with us in a unique way because of our historical context, and we're so saturated with pietism.
Yes,
that it's like we don't know what to do with this. But it's there.
It's there, and also
it's celebrated.
Which gets into another point about to back up a little bit. God's man, right? The man that God raises up. You had something where you talked about. It's almost like God chooses to surprise his people by the ones he raises up, right? Like, we're looking for a certain guy, and God raises up a guy that we go, that surely can't be the man God sent, right? And you have that kind of, this is an instance of something like that. It's so easy, these Hebrews who watch Moses do this don't see it as this is someone God's provided, right? They see it as,
and I think I mentioned something on Sunday. Like there's the. Can you imagine a story in which the deliverer shows up and nobody notices it?
Yes, right. Yes, which is exactly what we see happen with Jesus as well.
Yes.
So, but I think there's a little bit of a lesson there too, which is, what are the things what are the ways we've maybe gone beyond the Bible in saying God only works in this way, right? He only, I think that there's, if nothing but a question to ask yourself, I think that it's important to ask. I would just say, I think that one of those things that growing up in, American evangelicalism that was somewhat fresh, probably for you and I, is like, we just grew up with thinking that, a Christian leader just doesn't really talk too much about politics, right? Or doesn't get his hands dirty talking about, what's going on with governors and presidents. And I think that actually when someone starts doing that, all of a sudden they're like, whoa, Christians aren't supposed to do that. But it's like, wait a minute, what's the biblical precedent for Christians not doing that?
Right.
So what do you think? Can you think of anything else similar to that?
Well, part of what was rolling through my head in that comment is like all the stuff that we went through with like the COVID and you and I have talked, and I think we've talked on this podcast about like imperfect obedience in a time of war.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's so like they're smashing down the door and you're trying to protect your family, and meanwhile people who are doing nothing are being critical of your tactics. And it's like, well, we're kind of learning on the fly a little bit while they're and so I think that there's been a lot of that's going on, and that's not to say that there aren't things to learn.
Always are things to learn.
Always learning. You're always learning and repenting of sin. And it's like when Jesus gets arrested and Peter lops the ear off.
Yes.
It's like it was like, okay, put the ear back on, but you still got to
do
fight.
Over. Yeah,
do
exactly.
Over. Yeah. So
yeah.
Can I mention one thing that's, because I know our time's about ready to run out here.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting comment that I didn't mention at all on Sunday, and I think we can kind of just geek out on it a little bit here.
Let's do it.
It's in verse 23, and it's when Moses names his son. And he gives him the name Gershom, and it says, "For he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Okay? Now, a lot of people read that and think that the foreign land that Moses is talking about is Midian, right? But there's a possibility, maybe a good possibility, that that's not what he's talking about. The foreign land is Egypt.
Yeah.
And he knows there's a promised land that's coming. And that's like this, okay, we got to get out of this place because God has given us a promise. And he was in Egypt in the foreign land, not that Egypt was his home and Midian was the foreign land. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you have to read it that way just because of how frequently, I think even in Exodus in the laws, there's a couple different times where it's mentioned that you need to care for the foreigner because you were sojourners in a foreign land.
In a foreign land.
And he doesn't, they don't mean to those people who came out of Exodus, they don't mean somewhere like the wilderness. They mean Exodus. Sorry, Egypt. They mean that's what those passages are referring to.
Yeah.
Because Pharaoh did the opposite. He was cruel to the exile, or the what do they call those?
Sojourners.
The sojourners. He was cruel to them, and the lesson is don't be like your old slave master. Be like your God and Father who rescued you out of there and who loves the sojourner. So let's end on this last deal here. God's memory. I couldn't do this without ending on that one, because God's memory, you're taught. This chapter ends with, we get this portrait of Moses, and he gets married, which we could have talked about that too, we don't have enough time. But it's such a good go listen to the sermon on that one. But you have the people of God crying out for help. And then it says, and God heard their cry, and that I think there's like 4 or 5 words that he uses.
Yeah, he saw, he heard, he knew, he remembered.
Yes, he saw, he heard, he knew, he remembered. And if you read that quickly, you might say, "Oh, God forgot," right? He's remembering something. He must have forgot. But that's not what this passage is saying. It's saying something else. We want to kind of dig into that a little bit.
Well, yeah, I don't think I communicated this well on Sunday, but when I was talking about God remembering, I was trying to say God isn't going to act on behalf of his people because he feels bad for them.
Yeah.
Because if that's the case, then what happens when God doesn't feel bad for us?
Yeah.
Is that the only way that God gets involved? And when it says that he remembered, it's that God has made a promise.
Yep.
And God is fulfilling that promise.
Yep.
God is bound to his oaths because he is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. He does not bear false witness. He does not lie. And so God is acting on behalf of the covenant for his own name's sake, for the glory of his name, because he promised Abraham this family, and this fulfillment, and the nations. And because he made that promise, God is enacting. And it doesn't mean that for the first 400 years God forgot the promise, right? Because he told Abraham, your people, right, you're going to face these incredible, ridiculous odds of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. But I am not forgetting my promise to you. I am keeping my covenant, the oath that I made.
Yep, that's it's funny. I wrote in my notes, for his namesake, which I don't think you said that on Sunday. We were both connecting the dots here. That's the point, because God's name is his promise. Like it's like his word is his bond kind of thing. Yeah. Right. Yep. And the word there for remember is not like somebody. It's not the kind of word you'd use when someone just forgot something and remembered. It's actually the word used when you are acting out something that you said you'd do earlier. Yeah. It's like I made a promise and now I am acting upon it. One of the things I do think that is interesting is that in God's in God's sovereign plan, the acting out of his covenantal promises is preceded by God's people crying out to him.
Yeah.
And I think that I wrote down for his namesake because I think there is a little bit of an application and call to action here to prayer in the midst of all the insanity right now, because to use that covenantal language in our prayers, like, God, for your name's sake, like, stop the insanity.
Yeah.
Because the people are going after your families, your children, the fruit, the seed of the womb. They're doing that again. For your name's sake, act upon the promises you've made to Christians and to their children. So I think that's I love that passage because it's it reminds us that God he's so involved in the lives of his people. He sees, he hears, he remembers, he doesn't forget them.
Yeah.
He's bound himself to them such that they have his name, and he will act for them upon his name's sake.
Amen.
So, amen. So we should probably cut it. It's
Sounds
been a
good.
great. These are too fun. I always want. We used to do like hour-long episodes, but that was ridiculously long. So I think it's good we're keeping it short.
It's a measly 36 minutes this one.
Yes, 36 minutes. All right, you guys. Until next time, trust Christ, go to church, and love your neighbor. Peace.